All right, looks like we're rolling. Thanks very much for stopping by this live event presented by Rigging Dojo. We are Rigging Dojo. We're an online rigging and technical art school. If you don't know much about us, riggingdojo.com. It's pretty simple. The thing that sets us apart, or one of the things, is our curriculum. It's largely driven by the student needs, and you can find out more about how we work that on our FAQ. Basically, to summarize, the student submits what they would like to learn. We discuss it with the student, provide a mentor that is well versed in those topics, and then set up a session which runs 6 weeks and can ebb and flow to meet the student's needs. So that's it in a nutshell. We're really excited about this live event. We're working with Jeff Hesser, who I've known personally for, gosh, a year or two now. He came in and did some training for us at Turbine, the company I work for, my day job. Jeff's a great teacher, master of anatomy, super nice guy. I think he's going to really show some really cool stuff, and definitely applies to riggers, modelers, and animators. So if you have any friends looking for something to do tonight, send them a link. Okay? I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. Thanks for coming.
Hi, it's great to be with you all. We're going to start off with just an introduction to kind of talking about a basic approach to anatomy, a couple of things I think are important to keep in mind, and then I'm going to talk about the joint movements for about an hour, and then I'll leave some time for questions. If any questions come up along the way, just type them on up, and I'll try to answer questions as they go, or else we can just hold off and we'll do those at the end as well. Okay, so I'm just going to switch over. Great. Okay, I heard myself before, but I don't hear myself now. Okay, good. All right. Fantastic. So we're starting off with this image by Leonardo da Vinci as Vitruvian Man. Something I like to start off almost all my anatomy classes with. It's particularly relevant to what did I just do? Oh, great. Sorry. It's particularly relevant to what we're doing here tonight because of the emphasis that this image has on. You have to just hold on for one sec. I've been working in Max all day, and just having a little difficulty switching over to Maya. And it's particularly relevant to what we're doing because of the emphasis this image has on joint movement. But it's also particularly relevant just as a general image having to deal with anatomy for artists, because even though we look at this image, and this image is often associated with the history of anatomy, and often you see it on doctors' images or when they're dealing with anatomy. When Leonardo da Vinci made this, he actually changed anatomy a lot. He actually was not anatomically accurate to the truth of anatomy, but rather he took the information from anatomy and he manipulated it in order to fit into his larger design scheme. We can see that when we overlay the skeleton on top of it and start to look at a few aspects of the skeleton itself. One small thing we can see is when we look at the arm. If you look at this arm and you start to move it around, he wanted it to fit within that square, and he wanted it to fit within that square for some really important design reasons of his own. And that's because he wanted to take the sense that the human body can occupy the geometry of a square, and it also occupies the geometry of the circle. Now, a lot of that came from the Roman architect Vitruvius, and he wanted to do it that, but also because of a lot of Renaissance symbolism that the square represented things of the earth and the circle represented the divine. And so he was simply wanting to make the argument visually that the human body was the meeting of the symbols of the earthly and the divine. And so he wants to kind of make sure that happens. And so he wanted to make sure that the arms would fit in. But if we actually move that arm down, you can actually see that it ends up being a little bit on the short side for where we would actually normally see an arm. Even if we go and kind of bring the shoulder girdle down a little bit, which because it's been elevated there a little bit to get the arm up. We'll go over that later, how all that happens. But even if we bring that down, the fingers, when they come down, usually come down to about mid-thigh. These aren't quite there. So he's manipulating things there a little bit, but that's not really changing things because people's arms can fall within that range. So he's not manipulating things too much. However, when we go down here to the leg, a really interesting thing starts to happen, which is that when the leg rotates where it's supposed to rotate, right there at the hip socket, it rotates accurately, but that foot just won't stay in that circle. That finicky foot just doesn't want to go along with this argument of the human body fitting into the divine circle. And so what Leonardo da Vinci did was he actually moved that, and he made it so that his pivot was actually in the belly button area, which right here in the navel. And so when we have our pivot there in the navel, when we have our pivot point there in the navel, then watch that foot. That foot is staying nicely in the circle. That's fantastic, but oops, our hip joints come out of joint over there, and so that's kind of painful. And so, yeah, the human body stays within that nice divine circle, but we have to break the body in order to do it. So here's a kind of clear example where Leonardo da Vinci, who knew anatomy better than probably just about anyone during his time, is actually deciding to not be anatomically accurate in this moment, but rather he's making the choice that what's more important than anatomical accuracy is the accuracy of his design. This idea that the human body needs to fit both in a circle and a square, and he's going to break the rules of anatomy just to make sure that happens. And I think that's the reason I like to start off my anatomy classes with this little demo, is because it just kind of lays the groundwork, the kind of philosophical approach that anatomy is important, and it's important for artists to understand and kind of get a sense of anatomy. But the real thing that's important is your designs. And I'm going to be going over a whole lot of really specific joint movements over the next 45 minutes or so. But I want you to constantly remember that the reason I'm going over all these joint movements isn't because they are the thing that is right. What's right is what your art needs, what your design needs, what your rigs need in order to give the character the feel that it needs, in order to make the character feel real. And very often, in order to feel real, things actually have to be not real. Joints in a rig need to be in a place that's not anatomically accurate. But I'm a firm believer that if you know the anatomical accuracy, then you will have a better sense of what the illusion is you're trying to convey. And then even if you have to lie in order to tell that truth, you'll know what the truth is you're trying to lie about, so to speak. Enough with Leonardo. Let's go on. I want to talk for just a second too about what it is going on with this kind of weird skeleton I've got going. Just switch over to our other. Okay. Great. So this is a skeleton that was derived from a skeleton that I've been working with my students at RISD for a long time with, and very similar to the kind of approach that I learned at the Pennsylvania Academy and the New York Academy. And the idea is that within this skeleton, there's a lot of details that are not here. But the idea is to try to capture the essential forms that are important to remember. It's really easy when drawing a skeleton or sculpting a skeleton to get caught up in all those little bits and little tiny details. And often those details, by paying attention to them, one loses sight of the forest for the trees. And so this skeleton is a skeleton that's designed to kind of capture the things that are the most important that artists need. One of the things in the ribcage, pelvis, and skull, and this is more important for modelers perhaps than riggers or animators, that's really important to understand is the cross-section of these forms, what they look like when we look at them straight from above. And these simplified volumes really help to kind of create a form which is easily memorizable. And so one can learn a ribcage and learn how to memorize the ribcage really fairly quickly, so that then you can be able to conceptualize it from multiple places and multiple points in space. And so that's the kind of reasoning behind this simplified skeleton, is to kind of capture all of that. So let's go ahead and jump into talking about some of the movements of the skeleton. We're going to start off with the head. And a really cool and important thing to remember about the head is that the head, first of all, has its primary pivot point is at the bottom of the cranium. It's not at the bottom of the jaw. That's where I think some rigs like to put it down here, but that's often a problem to get things to kind of behave in a naturalistic way, because the pivot point is right here at the bottom of the cranium, and that's right about where the bottom of the nose is. If this figure were to be fleshed out, you'd see it would be right about at the bottom of the nose. And why it's especially important is because a lot of movement can happen right there. It doesn't even engage the neck at all. That has to do with this really wonderful and very beautiful design, a beautiful relationship between the first two vertebrae. They actually have special names. They're called the atlas and the axis. And your skull sits right on the top of the first vertebrae, which is called the atlas. And there's two little divots there, and there are two little bumps in the skull, and the bumps sit in those divots, and they can rock like a rocking chair. And so actually about 50% of saying yes can come just because your head is rocking right on those little divots on the top of the spine. Your neck isn't even engaged in that at all. It's just your head rocking right there on top of the spine. And then the second vertebrae down has a little finger, a little spike that pokes up through a hole in the atlas bone. This is called the axis. It's the second vertebrae, and the atlas can spin around that spike. And so the skull and your first vertebrae can rotate around, and about 50% of saying no is just your skull and that first vertebrae, and the rest of your neck is not engaged at all. It's basically just your skull, like I've got here in the demo, just your skull saying no, and about 50% of that, it's not really engaging the neck much at all. Now, once you go beyond that, once you go beyond 50%, then you start to get the neck being engaged. So here we got 50% of yes and 50% of no. And once you start to go beyond that, then you do start to get your neck is engaged in those movements, okay, like this. But it's just really important to remember that your neck doesn't always have to be engaged. Often your head can just move there, and it's important to remember that that movement is taking place not at the bottom of the chin, but right there at the base of the cranium. Okay. I'm going to move on now. We head down to, actually no, before we do that, we're going to talk about the rib cage. The rib cage also has a really kind of unique and interesting relationship with the spine. And one thing that has been a kind of convention for artists that goes back at least to Michelangelo, and really a lot of art before Michelangelo, is thinking of the whole rib cage as a solid unit, as though it didn't move at all. And anatomically, that's not quite true. Some of the lower ribs do move, but once you get up into the upper ribs, there really is very, very little movement there. That's because the upper 7 ribs have a direct connection to your breastbone or sternum, and therefore they're all pretty much locked in place. And the lower 5 ribs do have some movement in it, but it's been a convention for artists for a long time to kind of think of the rib cage as a pretty much of a solid unit. And we kind of think of it when it goes down, it kind of goes into the pelvis on one side, and it kind of goes down and goes into the pelvis on the other side. By the way, this is another kind of misconception that often people have, and it's probably because a lot of the way skeletons are put together, but a lot of people think there's a lot of space in between the rib cage and the pelvis. And in fact, there actually usually isn't very much space there at all, much less so than people often think. But you can see that when the rib cage goes down, that's really nice. You always think in terms of compression on one side and extension or stretch on the other side. But another interesting thing is happening here is if you look at the vertebrae, you can see that the vertebrae are bending. The bend goes up into the rib cage a little bit. And then you've got these vertebrae, the top vertebrae within the rib cage up through here. These top vertebrae in through here don't really bend very much at all. But they do, once you get down to about the wide point of the rib cage, which is about where the 12th rib begins, it connects, which is the last rib where it connects to the vertebrae. You do start to get some bending below that. That's because the vertebrae that are below that point are the lumbar vertebrae, and so they are bending. And so even though you don't get the rib cage doesn't bend, even though the rib cage doesn't really compress on itself, even though the rib cage is for the most part a pretty solid unit, there is some bending in the spinal column going up into about the bottom quarter or bottom third of the rib cage. Okay, you can see that happening with the rotation in there as well. Okay, and now we're going to start getting into some more fun stuff here. Let's start talking about the leg. Let me hide those handles real quickly just so we don't see those. Okay. All right. The leg. So the leg has all kinds of cool stuff in it. We're going to kind of get into more and more fun stuff as we go along. I'm going to end with the arm and the shoulder. And the arm and the shoulder are the most unique and difficult joints in the human body, and really complex the way that the arm integrates and works with the shoulder blade. And we're gonna end up there in just a little bit. But let's go ahead and start with the leg. There's a lot of cool stuff that happens to the leg, and also a lot of stuff often that I know when I learned it, I was surprised of as well. So let's, and often my students are pretty surprised about a couple things. One thing is that when your leg is straight, the rotation that happens when you're rotating your foot and your leg is straight, all of that rotation, as you can see here in this animation, all of that rotation is happening up at your hip joint. It's not happening anywhere else. It's all happening at your hip joint, and that's because the ligaments of your knee are all locked in place. It's not happening at your ankle, it's not happening at your knee, it's all happening up at your hip joint. However, as your knee bends, once your knee is bent, then your knee can rotate. Okay, and there is, if we look at this from above, once your knee is bent, this rotation happening. This isn't happening to your ankle. Often people kind of think that a lot of this rotation is happening to your ankle. Your ankle can't bend. Your ankle can do these kind of movements, which are actually both called flexion, because just the way that the joint is oriented. And if people are interested in that, I can explain later in the question and answer section why both of these movements are called flexion. We don't have something called flexion and extension. They're both called flexion. But your knee can rotate. All that rotation happens at your knee. It's not happening at your ankle joint. And you can see a little bit of rotation can go in, and there's quite a bit of rotation that can go out. So you can kind of point in towards your big toe just a little bit, but you can point out towards your little toe quite a bit, about 30 degrees. A lot of rotation out that way. Okay, and what all this allows is when you are, I know in the history of sculpture, one thing that's really important is that when you've got a figure who's in a contrapposto pose, like Michelangelo's David, when you've got a figure that's in a contrapposto pose like Michelangelo's David, one thing you can start to do is you can have this really wonderful rhythmic rotation that starts in the foot. So the foot might be oriented this way, and as you move up toward the knee, you're rotating this way, and as you come up toward the pelvis, you're going this way, and you could even continue that rotation up toward the rib cage and even into the head. One thing that Michelangelo loved to do, one of his favorite poses, was to have rotation that would start in the lower leg up through the knee, into the femur, into the pelvis, rotating more in the rib cage, and then when he gets up to his skulls, whap, he wraps it back the other direction. That's kind of a classic Michelangelo thing to do. And so this ability to do all to rotate at the knee has been really taken advantage of in the history of sculpture, but it's also something that in animation can be really taken advantage of too, that sense that you can create these wonderful spirals that run up through the body. But just keep in mind that rotation only happens when the knee is bent. You'll see that in that pose that I just created a minute ago, one of the things I did as I created that pose was I first flexed the knee. I first flexed the knee joint a little bit, and that loosens up the ligaments, and that allows that rotation to take place. Okay. Well, let's go over a couple other things that are to happen as the leg is moving. So we've dealt with all the rotation issues. Now look at as the knee is bending. Another cool thing happens, which is that the patella or kneecap follows with that motion. Let's get a good viewpoint on that. Okay. Watch that patella, watch that kneecap, and it just follows right along. And that's because there is, I don't have it in this model, but there's a ligament that runs from the bottom of the kneecap or patella and goes down to this little bump, right here on your tibia. You know, by the way, if somebody could just text, I'm using my cursor a lot on here. I'm assuming you all are seeing the things I'm pointing at with my cursor. Is my cursor showing up? Somebody could just type it. Okay, good, great. So you've got the bottom of the patella, and there's a ligament that goes down and attaches to that. It's called a tibial tuberosity right there on the tibia, and that ligament just gets pulled taut, and so the kneecap just goes right along for the ride as the knee is bending. It gets pulled into a groove that exists there in between the two sides of the bottom of the femur. Those are called the condyles of the femur, and so its orientation changes as you're bending your knee. Now, one thing to keep in mind about the kneecap is the kneecap is kind of a lazy fellow, and he always is kind of down, or he or she is always looking down at the earth, and so the kneecap is always kind of catching shadows. Something that's important for modelers to remember. And even as you bend your knee, even as it goes down, that changes. Once you've got a bent knee, then the kneecap starts to often look up. Okay, so in a bent knee, you've got a little bit of upward looking on the kneecap. That's not always the case. That depends a little bit on how some people's legs are organized. Every once in a while, I've seen a patella that will kind of look straight out when the knee is bent, but more often than not, the patella in a bent knee is looking up a little bit, as opposed to the straight leg, where the patella kind of tends to look down a little bit. Okay, and let's see if there's anything else I wanted to go over with this animation. One other thing, that's the reason I've got this kind of curve in here. The happiest place for our leg to be, when it is just happy and most comfortable, is when our femur is in this position right here. Okay, And that position is, it's flexed, means you brought your knee up towards your chest. It is abducted, which means the knee has been brought away from the center of the body. And that's the happiest place for it to be. And the reason that's the happiest place for it to be is when it's in that position, this ball at the end of your femur is most in line with a little, which I don't have in this model, but in the pelvis, there's this little bowl. And the little bowl is called the acetabulum, and that little bowl is what the head of the femur sits in. And when your leg is in this position, that's its most comfortable position. And why is that important for us to remember? Well, that's probably why when a lot of people sit down and relax and just kind of chill out, you collapse on the couch at the end of the day, this is the position that often our legs just kind of want to go in. It's just kind of sitting there like that with the knee slightly out. So that's one other thing. And the last thing I wanted to go over with this before we go to the next animation is having to do with that rotation. When your knee is bending, when you bend your knee, there is a little bit of lateral rotation that happens automatically. It has to do with the way in which the bone of the knee interlocks, the bone of the femur interlocks with the bone of the tibia. And I've got some bones here. If any people are interested, I can go over that in the question and answer session later on too. I can specifically show you what it is that happens there. But if you look at this foot, when your foot is straight, if we look down at this, you can see how the orientation of the kneecap and the orientation of the foot are pretty much in line. They're both looking in the same direction as each other. But once we bend that knee, we bend it, as we're bending the knee, there's a little bit of it's called lateral rotation. That means rotation going toward your little pinky toe. So now when we look down at it, look at the axis that the knee is facing and look at the axis that the foot is facing. They're no longer facing in the same direction. And that's because the tibia has, in the act of rotating, in the act of flexing rather, as you bend your knee, it has laterally rotated. It's moved this way just a little bit, okay? It's gone that way just a little bit. Now, do we have to do that? No, you don't have to do that because you have control over doing this. You can bend your knee and then do this. As you bend your knee, you can forcibly not do that if you don't want to do it. But it's kind of cool just to know that is the kind of thing it's the default thing that happens as you're bending your knee. It kind of is the default thing that happens with your knee as it's going on. So those are the movements of the knee. Let me take a quick look over here and just see if there were any yeah, maybe that is why people sleep with their legs over each other. All right.